Ever tripped and fallen?
Yeah.
I mean, we all have, right?
Yeah.
Especially as kids.
Yeah.
Bruised a knee, maybe scraped an elbow.
Yeah, part of growing up.
Exactly. But imagine if, well, what if a seemingly minor fall, like just a little tumble, led to something truly life-altering?
You're talking about those freak accidents you hear about, right? Where the outcome just doesn't seem to match the event.
Precisely. And that's exactly what we're diving into today. It's the case of Pet Welch. She was accused of, well, a horrific crime, all because her young son suffered a fatal injury after a fall.
This is going to be heavy, isn't it?
It is. And it takes us deep into some really complex territory. We're going to be looking at this thing called shaken baby syndrome, or SBS, and how sometimes what doctors believe, medical certainty, it clashes with real life, with the messy reality of things.
In this case, it really brings all of that to the forefront, doesn't it?
It does. So you gave us this 48 hours episode to work with, right? It's called A Mother Accused.
Right. A classic. It takes us back to 1999, Idaho Falls, Idaho.
Right. And it introduces us to Pet and Kelly Welch. They were a Mormon couple, devout, and they had this seemingly perfect life with their 2 adopted children, Shaylin and Stockton. Stockton was 19 months old.
The episode, it really paints this picture of them as this tight-knit family, really loving. It's important because of everything that happens next.
It's that contrast, right? The idyllic life shattered.
Exactly.
So it's May 1st, a Saturday morning, and everything seems totally normal. Kelly's outside doing yard work, Pet's in the kitchen, little Stockton's in the living room, just starting to walk and explore and get into everything.
Toddler life.
Right. And then it's like in an instant, everything changes. Stockton climbs up on a chair, and he falls.
Happens all the time.
Right. At first, it seems like just a typical toddler tumble. You wouldn't think twice about it.
But this fall, it had devastating consequences.
The episode makes that really clear, doesn't it?
It does.
Stockton starts showing all these signs of serious injury. He's unresponsive. He's having trouble breathing. It's terrifying. The Welches, they're panicked. And they rush him to the hospital. It was Eastern Idaho Regional Medical Center.
Every parent's worst nightmare.
Absolutely. And at the hospital, things take this really dark turn. The doctor who sees Stockton, Dr. Jeff Keller, he examines him.
Yeah.
And he immediately notices signs of really severe brain trauma.
This is where the shaken baby syndrome diagnosis enters the picture.
Right. And that diagnosis, it completely changes everything. It shifts the focus from medical care to a potential crime scene. Because based on what he's seeing, the brain swelling, the bleeding in the eyes, and the fact that there are no external injuries, Dr. Keller, he comes to this chilling conclusion. He says Stockton's injuries aren't consistent with a simple fall. He thinks something far more sinister happened. Shaken baby syndrome.
And that's when the Welches go from frantic parents to suspects. Just like that.
And so this diagnosis of SBS, it becomes the core of the whole case. But it's also incredibly controversial, isn't it?
It is. And for those listening who maybe aren't familiar with shaken baby syndrome, it's a really serious form of child abuse. Essentially, someone shakes a baby violently, and the baby's brain, it slams against their skull. And that can cause all sorts of terrible damage: brain swelling, bleeding, seizures, even death.
Horrific.
It is. But the controversy comes in because the diagnosis is often based on a few specific symptoms, like we talked about: the brain bleed, bleeding in the eyes, and no external injuries. And some medical experts, well, they argue that those same symptoms can be caused by other things too, maybe accidental falls or even some pre-existing medical conditions.
So you're saying there's debate within the medical community about how accurate this diagnosis is.
Exactly. And that debate becomes crucial in the Pet Welch case. Because while Dr. Keller and other doctors treating Stockton, they're convinced it's SBS. The Welches, they absolutely deny doing anything wrong. They insist that Stockton's injuries, they're all from that fall from the chair.
Right. So it's like this he said, she said situation, but with incredibly high stakes.
Yeah, and with a child's life hanging in the balance, it's not just about differing opinions, it's about potential criminal charges.
Right. And what makes it even more complicated is, well, the Welch's background. They have this perfect life, this reputation as loving parents, and all that. It kind of clashes with the harsh reality of what's happening to them in the legal system.
The episode does a great job of capturing that clash.
It does. So we have this incredibly tense situation. A grieving family facing accusations, a community trying to make sense of conflicting information, and a medical diagnosis that's far from clear-cut. What happens next?
Well, it's about to get a whole lot more complicated. Because with Stockton's condition getting worse, Child Protective Services gets involved. Which, that's standard procedure in these kind of situations. But for the Welches, it feels like another blow, like they're being treated as guilty before proven innocent. And the episode, it really goes into, how intense these interviews with Child Protective Services were, the scrutiny the Welches were under. I mean, they're grieving, trying to process this horrible loss, but they're also having to defend themselves against these awful accusations. It's just unimaginable.
I can't even imagine. To lose a child and then be suspected of causing that loss. It's a nightmare.
A total nightmare. And what's really striking is that, well, their reactions during the interviews, they're actually used against them.
How's that?
Well, like medical professionals, they were observing the interviews and they noted that she wasn't making eye contact, and Kelly, he was very emotional, and they interpreted that as signs of guilt.
So their grief, like their natural human reactions to this tragedy, it's twisted into evidence against them.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder, right? I mean, how do you know for sure that you're not mistaking like genuine grief for something more sinister?
It's a good question. It's really hard to separate those things sometimes. And unfortunately for the Welches, they just keep getting worse. Stockton's condition deteriorates, and despite everything the doctors try to do, he dies on the operating table.
Oh, it's just heartbreaking. Their son's gone, and now they're facing a potential homicide investigation.
Exactly. And with Stockton's death, well, the case, it shifts. It goes from suspected abuse to a possible murder charge. And just a few days after burying their son, Pet's charged with first-degree murder.
Wow. So the full force of the legal system is coming down on her. And this shaken baby syndrome diagnosis, it's the center of it all. It's like they're building this whole case around the idea that she's the one who did this.
Yeah, right. It's a very straightforward narrative for the prosecution. The medical evidence, it points to shaken baby syndrome. Pet was alone with Stockton when it happened, and her behavior during the interviews, well, it raised some red flags. It's a pretty compelling case.
But the Welches, they're not giving up. And their defense team, they're not either. They're ready to fight these charges. And they're going to take on the whole idea of shaken baby syndrome.
They bring in this neurosurgeon, Dr. Ronald Uzinski, and he's actually known for questioning the validity of shaken baby syndrome in a lot of cases. He argues that those three symptoms we talked about, the bleeding in the brain, the bleeding in the eyes, and no external injuries, those can be caused by a lot of things, not just shaking.
So he's saying there could be other explanations for Stockton's injuries.
Yeah, exactly. And he points out that just shaking alone, like without a really forceful impact, like hitting a hard surface, it's unlikely to cause that much brain trauma, the kind you see in SBS cases. So he suggests that maybe pre-existing conditions, maybe accidental falls, maybe even something from birth could have contributed to those symptoms.
So we have these two very different ways of looking at the medical evidence.
Yeah.
And it becomes this huge battle between the experts. It's almost like two sides of a coin.
And the episode, it presents both sides. It doesn't shy away from that complexity. It lets the viewers decide for themselves, weigh the evidence. It's a good reminder that even in cases that seem, open and shut, there's often more to the story than you see at first glance.
And in this case, it's not just about these conflicting medical opinions, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you have this family that's been ripped apart. You have a community that's divided. And you have a mother who's facing the unimaginable, being convicted of murdering her own child.
It's a lot to process. It really is. And the case, it's full of these emotional twists and turns. And just when you think you have a handle on it all, there's this bombshell revelation that throws everything into question.
Oh, this is where it gets really interesting. What happens?
Well, just before the trial is supposed to start, the prosecutor uncovers something that changes the whole game. And it has to do with Kelly, Pet's husband, and where he was when Stockton got hurt.
So there's new information that challenges the prosecution's version of events. That's huge.
It is, because initially Kelly, he told investigators he was outside doing yard work the whole time. But then in a pretrial hearing, he clarifies something. He says that he actually came back inside for a minute to check the time.
That small detail, it changes everything.
Yeah, because now there's reasonable doubt about who was actually with Stockton when he was injured. It's not just Pet anymore. The prosecutor has two adults who could have been involved. So now, proving that Pet was the one who did it, that she was solely responsible, it becomes a lot harder.
Wow. This is a real turning point. It basically undermines the whole case against Pet. So does the trial even happen at this point?
That's a great question, and that's where we're going to pick up next time. This case, It's a roller coaster. It's a whirlwind of emotions, legal complexities, and shocking revelations. It really makes you think about the limits of what we know, what we can know in medicine, and about the impact these kinds of accusations can have on families, families who might be completely innocent.
So the prosecution's case, it's kind of falling apart with this new information about Kelly being in the house. What happens next? Does it even go ahead with all this uncertainty?
Well, the prosecutor is facing this major setback, and he knows there's a real chance he could lose the whole case. So he offers Pet a plea deal. But it's not the usual kind of deal where she admits guilt and gets a lighter sentence.
So what is it then? What are Pet's options at this point?
He offers her what's called an Alford plea.
An Alford plea.
Yeah, it's a pretty unusual legal thing. Basically, it lets a defendant say they're innocent, but still plead guilty to a lesser charge. So Pet would be acknowledging that the prosecution, they might have enough evidence to convict her, but she wouldn't be actually admitting that she committed the crime.
That's a bit of a head-scratcher, isn't it?
Well,
So she's basically pleading guilty to avoid the risk of a trial, but she's not saying she did it. Seems like a strange loophole.
it is a weird one, and the episode, it shows how tough this decision was for Pet. I mean, she could fight for a full acquittal, go to trial, and say she's completely innocent. But that's a big risk. If the jury doesn't believe her, she could end up in prison for life.
Right.
Or she could take the Alford plea, get her freedom back, and most importantly, be reunited with Shaylin.
Yeah.
Her daughter had been in state custody this whole time.
Oh, wow. That's a heart-wrenching choice to have to choose between the truth and your family. What does Pet decide to do?
Well, after a lot of thinking and wanting so much to be with her daughter again, she decides to accept the plea. She pleads guilty to a lesser charge, injuring a child, but all along she maintains she's innocent.
It must have been incredibly difficult for her to say that word guilty, knowing in her heart that she didn't do it.
It's a really powerful moment in the episode. You see her break down in court. The weight of that decision, you can just see it on her face. It shows that sometimes, even when a case is over, legally speaking, there's no real closure, no sense that justice was actually done.
So what happens with the plea deal? What kind of sentence does she get?
The judge, he sentences her to 3 years of probation, no jail time. He even says that the guilty plea could be wiped from her record after the probation's over. So it's kind of a compromise, I guess. She gets to go home to her family, but there are still a lot of unanswered questions.
Seems like a pretty light sentence considering the original charge, murder. How did everyone involved react to this outcome?
It was mixed. The episode, it shows that, of course, the Welches and their supporters, they were just relieved to have the family back together. But there's this feeling that it's not really over, that Pet's name wasn't completely cleared. Some people felt like they could have won at trial, that they could have proved she was innocent.
And what about Dr. Keller? The doctor who made the initial shaken baby syndrome diagnosis. How did he feel about the plea deal and Pet not going to jail?
Oh, he was furious, absolutely furious. He was completely convinced that Pet was guilty and that the plea deal was, well, it was a travesty. He felt like the legal system had basically said Stockton's life didn't matter. And his reaction, it just shows how divided people can be in these kinds of cases, where medical opinions clash and the legal system has to find some kind of compromise.
So looking back at all this, all the twists and turns and emotions of this case, what are the key takeaways here? What can we learn from diving into this incredibly complex and controversial story?
I think it really highlights, just how complicated shaken baby syndrome diagnoses can be. And it raises some really big questions about the science behind it. Like, how sure can we be? And about bias in these investigations, both medical and legal. And of course, about the impact these accusations have on families who may have done nothing wrong.
It's a warning, right? A warning about the limits of what we know in medicine and about the need to understand how grief, how trauma, how that can affect people's behavior in these really stressful situations.
Exactly. And I think it makes us think about the role of the legal system. The Alford plea, it provided a solution, at least legally, but it left a lot of things unresolved and this feeling that maybe justice wasn't really served.
This deep dive, it's really been eye-opening. It's shown us the human side of this story, the real people behind the headlines, and it's exposed the complexities of a legal system that has to wrestle with medical evidence that's not always clear-cut. It's a story that sticks with you, makes you think about how fragile life is, how serious accusations are, and how our search for justice, it's not always perfect.
And for anyone listening who's been captivated by this story and wants to learn more about shaken baby syndrome, or or even just about the legal system and these ethical dilemmas, I really encourage you to do some digging, research the different opinions on SBS, look into things like the Alford plea, and talk about these issues with others. Sharing your thoughts, getting informed, it can all help create a more just and aware society.
Absolutely. And if you enjoyed this deep dive, make sure to subscribe to the deep dive for more explorations into these fascinating, complex topics. We'll continue to bring you these well-researched, engaging deep dives that leave you feeling informed, empowered, and ready to think critically about the world around us. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.